I killed him. The words were written in charcoal on a scrap of cloth, the confession of a woman who hadn't spoken in years. The drought had cracked the earth open like old leather. Creek beds that once ran clear now held nothing but dust and the bones of things that didn't make it through summer. In these hills, 6 miles from nowhere, the wind was the only thing that still moved freely. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and shimmering. This was a country that didn't forgive mistakes, and Owen Garrett was 3 days deep into it when he found her. Owen Garrett was a drifter with a past he couldn't outride. He'd lost his ranch to a card game, his brother to cholera, and his self-respect to choices made during the war. The kind of choices that followed a man, no matter how far he rode. Now he moved alone through forgotten territory, searching for something he couldn't name. Maybe redemption. Maybe just a place where the whiskey was cheap and nobody asked questions. When his horse climbed the ridge above the dried creek bed, he was thinking about water, until he saw the woman sitting on the rocks below, bare feet dangling over nothing, watching him with eyes that had already seen too much. She had copper-red hair, tangled and wild. Her dress was torn at the hem, and she sat perfectly still as he approached, no fear, no surprise, just a strange calm that unsettled him more than panic would have. She was alone. No horse, no supplies, no camp. Just a woman in the middle of nowhere who shouldn't have survived this long. Owen dismounted slowly, leading his horse by the reins. The leather creaked in the silence. His boots crunched on the dry earth. She didn't move. Just watched him come closer with those eyes that seemed to measure him against some invisible scale. When Owen asked if she was lost, she didn't answer. Didn't even part her lips. He tried again, asking if there was a camp nearby, someone he could take her to. Nothing. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. He studied her face, looking for signs of fever or madness, but found neither. She wasn't confused. She wasn't afraid. That was what unsettled him most. A woman alone in these hills should have been afraid, but she just looked at him like she was weighing something he couldn't see. When he asked if she could talk, she shook her head once. That silence, and the weight behind her eyes, told him this wasn't a woman who'd wandered off by accident. Owen stood there in the heat, hat in his hands, trying to figure out what a decent man was supposed to do. He couldn't just leave her. He knew what happened to women alone in these hills. Knew it the way he knew the sun would rise tomorrow and burn just as hot. So he offered her his bedroll, some jerky, and shelter at an old line shack 6 miles north. Told her she could stay there till they sorted this out. She stood without hesitation and walked to his horse like she'd been waiting for him all along. No gratitude, no questions, just acceptance. She didn't reach for the reins or look back at the rock where she'd been sitting. Just stood beside his mare, patient as stone. And Owen, against every instinct that told him to keep riding, decided to see this through. He didn't know her story yet. Didn't know her name or where she'd come from or what had brought her to this dried-up creek in the middle of hell's own country. But something about her silence felt like his own. Something about the way she carried herself, like she'd survived things that should have killed her, reminded him of the man he saw in the mirror. So he helped her onto his horse and turned north toward the line shack, carrying a stranger toward an uncertain future, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The line shack was 3 walls of weathered timber and a roof that mostly held. It sat in a shallow depression between 2 hills, hidden from the main trail. Owen had used it before, back when he was running cattle for a rancher who'd since gone bankrupt. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. The single window had no glass, just a wooden shutter that didn't quite close. Inside, there was a stone fireplace, a few rusted pots, and enough space for 2 people who didn't mind being close. Owen gave her the bedroll and took the floor. She didn't protest. Didn't offer to share or suggest he take the better spot. Just accepted it the way she'd accepted everything else, with that same quiet resignation that made him wonder what kind of life taught a person to expect so little. For 2 days, they existed in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind that begged to be filled, but something else. Something that felt almost natural. Owen would wake before dawn and check his traps. She'd be awake when he returned, sitting by the cold fireplace, waiting. He hunted rabbits and once a prairie chicken that had been too slow to escape his aim. She cooked it over the fire he built, seasoning the meat with wild herbs she'd gathered from the hillside. She moved through these tasks with practiced efficiency, like she'd been doing them her whole life. He fixed the leak in the roof where rain had rotted through the pine boards. She swept the dirt floor with a bundle of dried grass tied with a strip from her petticoat. They worked around each other like dancers who'd learned the same steps separately. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same pot, she didn't flinch. When he passed too close in a small space, she simply moved aside. There was no awkwardness between them. Just two people who'd both learned how to be alone, now learning how to be alone together. Owen found himself talking sometimes while they worked. Nothing important. Just words to fill the space. He told her about his brother who died of cholera on the trail to California, how he buried him without a proper coffin or a preacher's words. About the ranch he'd lost in a card game, he'd been too drunk to walk away from, watching 5 years of work disappear on a pair of threes. About the shame that chased him across 3 territories, always one town behind but never quite catching up. She never wrote back during these talks. Just listened with her head tilted slightly, her hands moving through whatever task occupied them. But he could tell she heard every word. He could see it in the way her movements slowed when he said something that mattered. On the 3rd morning, he woke to find her gone. His stomach dropped. The bedroll was empty, still holding the shape of her body. Owen pulled on his boots without bothering to lace them and stepped outside, scanning the hills with a sick feeling rising in his chest. The morning was gray and cool, the sun not yet over the eastern ridge. His horse stood hobbled where he'd left it, undisturbed. No tracks led away from the shack except the ones he'd made yesterday. For a moment, he thought maybe he'd imagined her entirely. 3 days of loneliness and too much sun finally caught up to him. Then he saw her. She was sitting in the same spot where he'd found her 3 days ago, or as close to it as the land allowed. The dried creek bed wound through the hills like a scar, and she'd walked back to it in the pre-dawn darkness. Her feet dangled over the edge of a flat rock. Her back was straight. She was holding something in her hands, and even from a distance, Owen could see her fingers moving with careful purpose. When he approached, she didn't look at him. She was too focused on what she held. A piece of charcoal from the fire, and a scrap of cloth torn from the lining of his saddlebag. She'd written on it. Owen's hands shook as he took it from her outstretched palm. The letters were uneven, scratched into the fabric with pressure that had nearly torn through in places. But the words were clear enough. I killed him. He stood there with the cloth in his hands, feeling the weight of those 3 words settle over him like a physical thing. The morning air was still cool, but sweat prickled at the back of his neck. He looked down at her, at the copper hair catching the first light, at the rigid set of her shoulders. She was waiting for something. Judgment, maybe. Or disgust. The kind of reaction she'd probably gotten from everyone else who'd learned her secret. Owen sat down beside her. Didn't speak for a long time. Just watched the empty creek bed below them, the way the shadows moved across the cracked earth as the sun climbed higher. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispered conversations. Your husband, he finally asked. She nodded. He hurt you. Another nod, slower this time. Her jaw tightened in a way that made Owen notice for the first time how it sat slightly crooked. How one side didn't quite line up with the other. An old break, healed wrong. Owen folded the cloth and handed it back to her. Then he had it coming. Her eyes snapped to his, surprised. Maybe suspicious. Like she was waiting for the rest of it, the part where he called her a murderer or damned or worse. But Owen just sat there, his expression unchanged, meaning every word he'd said. "I mean it," he continued. "Some men don't deserve the air they breathe. Some men use up all the mercy they're owed long before they meet their end. Sounds to me like your husband was one of those." She took the cloth, held it in both hands like it was something precious. Her fingers trembled slightly. Then she pulled the charcoal across it again, working slowly, forming new letters beneath the old ones. "Everyone says I'm damned." Owen read the words and felt something hot and angry rise in his chest. Not at her. In the world that had put that thought in her head. At the people who'd looked at a woman defending herself and seen sin instead of survival. "Everyone's a fool," Owen said. She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth twitched upward for just a second before falling back into its usual line. But Owen saw it. That tiny crack in the armor she wore. That brief moment where she let herself believe maybe he was telling the truth. They sat there as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot. Owen told her about the war. About the things he'd done for money when honor became a luxury he couldn't afford. About the town in Missouri where he'd shot a man over a stolen horse, only to learn later the horse had actually belonged to the man he'd killed. About the weight of that mistake, how it sat on his chest some nights and made it hard to breathe. She listened without judgment. Without the condemnation he'd gotten used to seeing in people's eyes when they looked at him too long. When he finished talking, she wrote again. "Why did you stop?" Owen knew what she meant. Why had he stopped running? Why had he stopped killing? Why had he chosen to become something other than what the war had made him? "Because I got tired," he said simply. "Tired of being afraid of my own shadow. Tired of waking up and not recognizing the man looking back at me." She wrote another question. What was her name? Owen blinked. Whose name? She tapped the charcoal against the cloth, then added more words. "The woman who made you want to stop." Owen let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She'd seen right through him. Understood that men like him didn't change on their own. That it took something, or someone, to make them want to be different. "Margaret," he said. Her name was Margaret. Met her in Cheyenne. She ran a boarding house near the railway station. Had these green eyes that seemed to look straight through all the lies a man could tell. He paused, remembering. "She loved me until she learned what I'd done for money during the war. After that, she couldn't even look at me. Told me I had blood on my hands that no amount of soap would ever wash clean." "Do you think about going back?" "Every day," Owen admitted. But she made it clear. There's no going back to something that's already dead. The woman, he still didn't know her name, studied his face for a long moment. Then she wrote something that made his throat tight. "I think you punish yourself more than God ever would." Owen stared at those words until the fire inside the shack had burned low and the evening shadows stretched long across the hills. She'd written truth in a way he'd never been able to speak it. All these years, he'd been running from himself, carrying guilt like a second skin, believing he deserved every bit of suffering that came his way. And here was this silent woman, this stranger with her own terrible burden, seeing him clearer than he'd ever seen himself. That night, something shifted between them. Owen found himself talking more freely, telling her things he'd never told anyone. About the first man he'd killed in the war, a boy really, couldn't have been more than 17, who'd looked at Owen with surprise rather than fear when the bullet hit. About the farm he'd grown up on in Ohio, before his father drank himself to death and the bank took everything. About the dreams he used to have of settling down somewhere quiet, raising horses maybe, living a life that didn't require looking over his shoulder. She listened to it all. And at night, by the light of the fire, she'd write her own stories. "My mother kept a garden. Tomatoes, squash, beans. She taught me their names before I could write them. I married him at 15. My father owed him money. I was the payment. He broke my jaw the first time I said no. I was 16. It never healed right. That's why I can't talk. Each revelation came slowly, carefully, like she was testing the weight of sharing them. Owen read every word and never once looked at her with pity. Just understanding. They were two people who'd survived things that should have killed them, finding something like peace in the middle of nowhere. 3 weeks passed this way. The rhythm of their days became comfortable. Natural. Owen would wake to find her already up, coaxing the fire back to life. They'd eat breakfast in companionable silence. He'd tend to the horse while she gathered wood or mended the holes in their clothing with thread she'd pulled from the hem of her dress. In the afternoons, when the heat became unbearable, they'd sit in the shade of the shack, and she'd write questions while he answered them. Have you ever been happy? Do you believe in second chances? If you could go anywhere, where would you go? Owen answered honestly every time. And slowly, carefully, they built something between them that neither had words for. Something that felt like trust. Maybe even hope. Then the rider came. Owen was outside splitting wood when he heard the horse. The rhythm of the axe stopped mid-swing. He set the blade down carefully and reached for his rifle, leaning against the shack wall where he always kept it. The woman was inside preparing their midday meal. He could hear the scrape of the pot against stone. The rider came up the trail slowly. Not trying to hide his approach, but not hurrying either. Owen stepped into the open, rifle held loose but ready. The man was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard that reached his chest. He sat his horse like someone who'd spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. The star pinned to his vest had seen better days, the metal was tarnished, and one point had broken off entirely. Help you? Owen asked. The marshal pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough to draw if things went wrong. His eyes took in everything, the shack, the smoke from the chimney, Owen's stance, the rifle. Looking for a woman, the marshal said. His voice was rough, worn down by years of tobacco and dust. Red hair. Can't speak. Killed her husband over in Flat Rock about a month back. Owen's grip tightened on the rifle. He kept his face neutral, his voice steady. What did the husband do? The marshal spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Does it matter? It does to me. The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. Broke her jaw so bad it never healed right. That's why she can't talk. Happened when she was 16. Married him at 15. He paused. Husband kept her locked in their cabin most days. Neighbors said they'd hear things sometimes. Sounds that made them close their windows. Owen felt something cold slide down his spine. How'd she kill him? Kitchen knife while he slept. Stabbed him 17 times. Left him on the floor and walked out the door. Didn't take anything with her. Not food, not money, not even shoes. Just walked out into the night and disappeared. The marshal's eyes narrowed. Some folks in Flat Rock want her hanged. Say murder's murder, regardless of what came before. And what do you say? I say I've been wearing this star for 32 years. Seen enough to know the difference between evil and desperation. He looked toward the shack again. Where is she? Owen's jaw tightened. Haven't seen anyone. The marshal's gaze drifted to the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. To the second set of footprints in the dirt near the door. To the woman's torn dress drying on a rock in the sun. She'd washed it yesterday in the water Owen had hauled from a spring 2 miles west. That's so, the marshal said quietly. That's so. They stood there in the dust and heat, two men who'd both seen enough of the world to know when a thing was right and when it wasn't. The marshal's hand rested on his saddle horn, nowhere near his gun. Owen's finger stayed outside the trigger guard of his rifle. The moment stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Finally, the marshal nodded slowly. "You know, a funny thing happened back in Flat Rock. The husband's brother, mean son of a bitch named Clayton, he came looking for justice. Wanted to track down the woman who killed his kin. Put together a whole search party." Owen said nothing. Just waited. "I told him she'd gone east," the marshal continued. "Told him I'd tracked her to the rail station in Omaha. Told him she'd bought a ticket to Chicago and disappeared into the city. Clayton and his boys rode out 3 days ago, headed that direction." The marshal gathered his reins. "I'm too old to chase ghosts. Too old to pretend I don't know the difference between justice and revenge." He turned his horse, then paused. "You see her, you tell her something for me." "What's that?" "Tell her Clayton's the kind of man who doesn't give up easily. Tell her to stay gone. Stay quiet. Stay far away from anywhere she used to be." The old lawman's eyes met Owen's one last time. "And tell her some of us know she did what she had to do." Owen watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the hills, then nothing at all. The dust settled. The silence returned. Owen stood there with the rifle in his hands, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The marshal had given them a gift: time, distance, a false trail for anyone looking. But gifts like that came with the understanding that they wouldn't be offered twice. When Owen turned back to the shack, she was standing in the doorway. She must have heard everything. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Owen walked to her, slow and steady, the way he'd approach a spooked horse. "He's gone," Owen said. "He's not coming back." She searched his face, looking for something. Reassurance maybe. Or proof that he meant what he said. Then she stepped back inside, moving to the small table where she kept her charcoal and scraps of cloth. Her hands shook as she wrote. "You lied for me." "I did." "Why?" Owen set the rifle down and sat across from her. Outside, his horse nickered softly. A crow called from somewhere in the hills. He thought about all the reasons he could give her. Because it was the right thing to do. Because the law wasn't always just. Because he understood what it meant to survive something terrible. But when he spoke, what came out was simpler than all of that. "Because some debts get paid in full the moment they're made," he said. "And because I'm tired of living in a world where the wrong people suffer." She set down the charcoal and looked at him for a long time. Really looked at him, the way she had that first day by the dried creek bed, like she was measuring him against something only she could see. Then she picked up the charcoal again. Her hand moved slowly, carefully, forming words that took longer than the others. "Will you teach me to read? The words I write, I only know them from the Bible my mother taught me. I want to know more words. I want to say more things." Owen's throat tightened. In all the talking they'd done, all the stories they'd shared, she'd never asked him for anything. Never requested a single thing beyond the shelter and food he'd already been given. But now she was asking for this, for knowledge, for language, for the ability to speak in ways her broken jaw never would. "Yeah," he managed. "I can do that." She wrote something else, the charcoal moving faster now. "Will you stay?" The question hung between them like smoke. Owen should have said no. Should have told her he was a drifter, that staying wasn't in his nature, that every place he'd ever settled eventually fell apart. Should have reminded her that men like him didn't get happy endings, that he carried too much history and too many ghosts to be any good for someone trying to start over. Should have explained that she deserved better than a man who'd spent 10 years running from himself. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "Long as you'll have me." She picked up the charcoal one more time. Her fingers steadied as she wrote, the letters coming clearer now, more confident. My name is Iris. Owen reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond helping her onto his horse that first day. Her skin was rough from work, scarred across the knuckles. Her fingers were stained with charcoal and dirt. But when she squeezed back, there was strength in her grip that surprised him. Owen, he said. Pleased to meet you, Iris. Her fingers tightened around his. Outside, the wind moved through the hills like a long-held breath finally released. The afternoon sun slanted through the crooked door, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. For the first time since he'd found her, Owen saw something in her eyes that wasn't weariness or pain. It was small, fragile as new glass, but it was there. Hope. They stayed through autumn. The days grew shorter and the nights brought cold that seeped through the gaps in the shack walls. Owen chinked the worst of the holes with mud and grass. He hunted deer, and they smoked the meat to last through winter. Iris, he could think of her by name now, gathered the last of the wild herbs before the frost killed them. They stacked firewood against the north wall until they had enough to last months. And every day, Owen taught her letters. He started by scratching them in the dirt with a stick. A, B, C. She learned fast, hungry for it in a way that made his chest ache. Within a week, she knew the whole alphabet. Within 2, she was sounding out simple words. Cat. Dog. Sunday moon. She'd point at things around the shack, and he'd tell her the letters, and she'd practice writing them over and over until her fingers cramped. By the time the first snow came, she was writing full sentences. Not just the fragments she'd managed before, but complete thoughts strung together with the grammar her mother had taught her from the Bible. She wrote stories about her childhood, about the garden her mother had kept, about the yellow dress she'd worn to church on Sundays, about the brother who died of scarlet fever when she was 8. She wrote about the life she'd thought she'd have before her father's debts had changed everything. And sometimes, late at night when the fire burned low, and the coyotes sang in the distance, she'd write, I'm glad you found me. Every time, Owen would take the stick and write back in the dirt beside the fire, me too. They never spoke of love. Didn't have a word for what they were building between them in that broken-down shack in the middle of nowhere. But it was there anyway, growing like winter wheat under snow, invisible but alive, waiting for the right season to show itself. Owen found himself changing in small ways. He stopped looking over his shoulder every time a sound carried on the wind. Stopped flinching awake in the middle of the night, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. The nightmares that had followed him for years came less frequently. And when they did come, he'd wake to find Iris sitting beside him, her hand resting light on his shoulder, her presence steady as stone. She changed too. The rigid set of her shoulders began to soften. She smiled more, quick, fleeting things that came and went like birds, but real nonetheless. She moved through the shack with less caution, no longer bracing for blows that wouldn't come. Once, Owen came back from checking his traps to find her humming. No words, just a melody that rose and fell like wind through grass. When she saw him watching, she didn't stop. Just kept humming while she worked. December came hard and cold. Snow piled against the shack walls and turned the world white and silent. They were snowed in for 3 days straight, the wind howling like something alive and angry. Owen kept the fire burning while Iris rationed their supplies with the careful precision of someone who'd known hunger before. They huddled close for warmth, sharing the single bedroll now without hesitation or shame. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Owen dug them out and stood in the doorway, looking at a landscape transformed. Everything was clean and new, buried under 2 feet of powder that sparkled in the morning sun. Iris came to stand beside him, her shoulder touching his. She had her writing cloth in her hands, the same scrap she'd used that first day to confess her sin, now covered in layers of charcoal words, each one written over the last. She wrote something new. Do you ever regret it? Finding me? Owen looked down at her. At the copper hair that caught the light like fire. At the crooked jaw and the scars on her hands. At the woman who'd survived things that would have broken most people, who'd killed to save herself and carried the weight of it alone until a stranger had told her she didn't have to. Not once, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun climb higher and turn the snow to diamond dust. A rabbit hopped across the clearing, leaving delicate tracks. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle called. The world felt vast and clean and full of possibilities, neither of which they had dared imagine a few months ago. That evening, after they'd eaten and the fire had settled into coals, Iris wrote the longest passage Owen had seen from her yet. She worked on it for nearly an hour, erasing and rewriting, choosing each word with care. When she finished, she handed it to him with hands that trembled slightly. I used to think I was broken. That's what he did to me. The beatings, the locked doors, the way he made me small, had destroyed whatever good was in me. I thought killing him proved it. Proved I was damned, as everyone said. But you looked at me and saw something different. You saw someone worth saving. Worth teaching. Worth staying for. I don't know if I believe in God anymore. Don't know if there's mercy waiting for people like us. But I know this. You gave me back my voice. Not the one that was taken when my jaw broke. A different one. A better one. And for that, I will be grateful every day I have left. Owen read it twice. Then a third time. His vision blurred, and he had to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. When he looked up, Iris was watching him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Open. Unguarded. Completely free of the fear that had shadowed her since the day they met. He took the stick and wrote in the dirt beside the fire, letters large enough for her to read in the flickering light. You saved me too. She read it and nodded slowly. Then she moved closer, settling against his side the way she had in the doorway that morning. Owen put his arm around her shoulders and felt her relax into him, her breathing matching his. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, soft and quiet. The fire crackled. The wind sang low through the gaps in the walls. They sat together like that until the fire burned down to ash and the darkness wrapped around them like a blanket. Two people who'd been lost, finding their way to something that looked like home. Two people who'd survived the worst the world could offer and chosen, against all odds, to believe in something better. Some things were bigger than words anyway. If you enjoyed Iris and Owen's story, leave a like and subscribe for more forgotten tales of the frontier. Thanks for listening.